It started with a blaring megaphone at 6:30 in the morning and a voice that sounded like a blender full of gravel and glitter yelling, "Get out of the car, now, this is an HOA emergency." My wife Rachel, still in her sheriff uniform from the overnight shift, blinked once, leaned forward from the driver's seat, and calmly sipped her coffee. She hadn't even stepped out of our car yet. That's when Karen, the HOA president with a personal vendetta against anything that looked like authority she couldn't control, smacked a neon orange sticker on the windshield of our police-issue SUV and shouted to no one in particular that she was placing my wife under citizen's arrest. For parking. In our own driveway. On our private property. In front of our house. While wearing a badge. What Karen didn't know, what she never bothered to check, was that my wife wasn't just a deputy. She was the sheriff. And she was about to teach Karen a lesson in jurisdiction, humiliation, and the very long arm of the law. The day before had been chaos. Rachel had responded to an armed robbery, a missing child call, and then ended her shift with a 3-hour hostage negotiation that ended peacefully, thanks to her calm nerves and fast thinking. She rolled into our driveway just before dawn, exhausted but satisfied, only to be met by the screech of Karen's golf cart zipping down the street like a suburban missile. Karen, wrapped in a glittery HOA windbreaker like it was armor, skidded to a halt beside our mailbox and came storming up the driveway with a clipboard and one of those orange violation stickers usually reserved for abandoned vehicles. She marched straight past the property line like it owed her money. Rachel looked at me as I stepped onto the porch with my coffee. I was still half asleep, wearing a robe and one slipper, but I knew better than to interrupt a Karen in full performance mode. Karen started snapping pictures of Rachel's police SUV, muttering about visual clutter, code violations, and how squad cars aren't approved vehicles under HOA beautification guidelines. She declared that any vehicle not listed in the HOA's vehicle registry was subject to immediate citation and removal. Rachel raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Karen then slapped the orange sticker across the windshield like she was branding a cow and said, "You have 10 minutes to move it or we tow." That's when Rachel stepped out, all 5'8" of her, calm and composed in full sheriff gear. Karen hesitated, but only for a moment. She looked Rachel up and down, decided she didn't look intimidating enough, and doubled down. "This uniform doesn't scare me," she snapped. "We've had people pretending to be cops to intimidate us. You think you're the first one to pull this stunt?" I could see Rachel mentally calculating whether Karen had hit her head recently or was simply drunk on HOA bylaws. Rachel didn't raise her voice. She didn't flash her badge. She simply asked, "Are you sure you want to continue this conversation on record, ma'am?" Karen didn't catch the meaning. She called in her so-called enforcement team, 2 elderly HOA volunteers wearing windbreakers with Neighborhood Command printed on the back. They showed up carrying fake ticket books, and one of them even had a plastic badge from a Halloween costume. Karen barked orders at them like she was leading a military operation. One took a knee in front of the tire to measure its distance from the sidewalk. Another began writing what I could only guess was a citation for excessive tire thickness. I started recording from the porch. I figured if this went sideways, at least I'd have solid footage for the county's annual Idiots of the Month meeting. Rachel gave me a small nod, which I understood to mean let it play out. Karen was ranting about her cousin at the zoning board and how he would be here shortly to validate the arrest. Rachel stayed cool. She asked what exactly she was being accused of. Karen loudly declared impersonating an officer and obstructing HOA compliance enforcement. "That's a felony," she added triumphantly. Rachel tapped her earpiece and calmly called dispatch. "Code 10-45A," she said. "Harassment of a law enforcement officer." Dispatch confirmed the call, and Rachel quietly gave our address. Karen, completely unaware, turned to me and said, "Your wife's in a heap of trouble, mister. The HOA has jurisdiction here. This is a shared neighborhood. Driveways are not technically private property unless specifically stated." I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my coffee. Karen mistook my laugh for fear. She smirked and said better start thinking about hiring a real lawyer. 5 minutes later, we heard sirens. 3 patrol vehicles pulled up in front of the house. Karen turned triumphantly, assuming her cousin had sent in reinforcements. But when the officers stepped out and saluted Rachel, the expression on her face could have curdled milk. Officer Miguel, Rachel's longtime partner and one of the funniest guys on the force, walked up and asked Sheriff, "Everything okay here?" Karen blinked. "Sheriff," she said. "Sheriff, what are you talking about?" That's when Rachel showed her badge. County Sheriff Rachel Lynn. Appointed 6 months ago. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a goldfish out of water. Rachel explained to Miguel and the others that the HOA president had tried to arrest her for parking her marked sheriff vehicle in her own driveway. Miguel turned to Karen and asked if she understood what impersonation of law enforcement looked like. Karen backed up and said, "I was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe." One of the HOA enforcers tried to sneak off but tripped over the sidewalk and fell onto the lawn, groaning. The other suddenly developed selective amnesia and claimed he was just here to drop off a newsletter. Miguel asked Rachel if she wanted to press charges. She shook her head but said she would be filing a formal complaint. Karen tried to save face by demanding proof that the property was outside HOA control. "That's when I brought out our deed. It clearly stated that our house and driveway were part of a grandfathered zone exempt from HOA oversight due to being constructed before the community bylaws were enforced." Karen sputtered, but that can't be. "I updated the registry myself." Rachel asked her if she had filed those updates with the county land office. Karen looked around for an escape route. Rachel then asked, "Would you like to come downtown and explain this in an official statement, or are we done here?" Karen didn't answer. She turned, got into her golf cart, and sped off, knocking over our recycling bin in the process. I looked at Rachel. She looked at me. I said that was better than reality TV. She said no, that was the pilot episode. The season's just getting started. It didn't take long for the news to spread. By the time the sun was fully up and most people were sipping their second cup of coffee, the neighborhood group chat had already exploded. Screenshots from my video had been posted, complete with play-by-play captions like "HOA Queen gets schooled by sheriff and you can't arrest the law, Karen." Reactions ranged from hysterical laughter to cautious curiosity, but the general mood was one of long overdue vindication. For months, maybe years, Karen had ruled the HOA with a glittery iron fist, handing out petty fines, citing obscure regulations, and declaring herself the final authority on everything from lawn ornaments to garage door shade. Now she had tried to arrest the actual sheriff on her own property and failed spectacularly. Rachel wasn't in much of a mood to celebrate. She had dealt with a hostage situation the night before, and now this ridiculous encounter barely 6 hours later. Still, she made time to file a preliminary complaint with the county's legal affairs office and submitted the bodycam footage, along with my porch recording. Not because she wanted revenge, but because she knew this sort of behavior, if left unchecked, would escalate. And she was right. That same afternoon, a certified letter arrived at our door. It was from the HOA, bearing Karen's signature, and it accused Rachel of creating a hostile environment, impersonating law enforcement to intimidate residents, and violating community decorum with an unregistered government vehicle. Rachel read it once, exhaled through her nose, and muttered, "Well, this got dumb faster than I expected." We knew Karen wouldn't take the public humiliation lightly, but neither of us expected her to try doubling down with actual legal threat. The letter also demanded that Rachel cease all use of the driveway for law enforcement vehicles, effective immediately, or face a formal action for trespass and intimidation. Rachel chuckled, but there was steel behind it. She was already making calls before she finished her second sip of coffee. The letter wasn't just absurd, it was actionable. She reached out to the county legal advisor, a friend named Hannah, who immediately asked if she could get popcorn before reviewing the footage. Within an hour, Hannah had drafted an official response that made Karen's letter look like a child's crayon drawing. It cited multiple violations of state statutes, impersonation of legal authority, misuse of HOA powers, and a potential interference with law enforcement operations. She even attached a request for a cease and desist order against Karen herself for ongoing harassment. The paperwork was formal, thorough, and just polite enough to be legal while still letting Karen know she was in over her head. By the next morning, two things happened. First, a squad car from the sheriff's office arrived with a deputy to personally serve Karen the cease and desist order. Second, Karen had printed flyers and was handing them out door to door. Each flyer warned residents of dangerous impersonators wearing stolen uniforms and pretending to be county officials, complete with a blurry screenshot of Rachel standing next to her own cruiser. Karen claimed she was protecting the neighborhood from frauds and had uncovered a deeper conspiracy involving rogue public employees. Neighbors called us all day. Some laughed. Some were concerned. A few admitted they were honestly confused. Rachel, to her credit, never got angry. She knew Karen was spinning out, and sometimes the best thing you can do with a spinning top is let it wear itself out. But still, the accusations were now in writing and distributed publicly. That changed things. That turned Karen's rant into defamation. Rachel brought it all to the county office. Now it wasn't just a neighborhood dispute. It was a legal matter. That evening, a small group of neighbors stopped by. They brought cookies and apologies. One of them, a man named Dave who had once been fined for painting his shed a shade too close to turquoise, handed Rachel a thumb drive. On it were screenshots and emails Karen had sent over the past year. Some were laughable, like her argument that tall sunflowers promoted criminal behavior. But others were deeply problematic. There were threats to revoke access to community facilities, random late-night patrol reports that listed specific families as suspicious, and a draft email to the board suggesting the HOA install plate readers at the neighborhood entrance. Rachel scrolled through them, her face going from amused to stern. The emails revealed a pattern. Karen wasn't just eccentric. She was actively targeting anyone who didn't fall in line, using HOA power like a weapon. And now that power had been turned on Rachel. But Rachel had a badge and a jurisdiction larger than this tiny suburban kingdom. She knew what to do. The next morning, we paid a visit to the county records office. I had always assumed that HOAs operated under some dusty, mysterious force of nature, like gravity or static cling. But no, it turns out they have to follow rules too. And one of those rules is submitting accurate jurisdictional maps and boundary documents. Rachel requested the HOA's most recent filings. The clerk looked surprised and said those hadn't been updated in over a decade. The original documents, signed in 2008, clearly showed that our property, including the driveway, was listed as non-HOA land due to an early exemption clause during the community development phase. Rachel smiled. She made copies, and then we went straight to the sheriff's office and filed a formal motion to review the HOA's legal standing. That alone didn't shut things down, but it put Karen's entire operation under a very bright spotlight. She might have been used to scaring off school teachers and retired grandfathers, but now she was in a different arena. And the person she tried to intimidate was now actively auditing every corner of her paper kingdom. That night, Karen went live on the community Facebook page. With dramatic piano music playing in the background and a weird candlelit glow on her face, she ranted for 12 full minutes about threats to neighborhood safety, law enforcement conspiracies, and how a certain woman who wore a badge had brought corruption into their sanctuary of peace. The video was shared 37 times and immediately ratioed with comments like "You lost your mind, Karen," and "Sheriff owns that driveway, you loony." Karen shut off comments 2 hours later. Meanwhile, Rachel was contacted by someone unexpected, a former member of the HOA board named Nadine. She said she'd resigned 2 months ago after Karen pushed through a policy banning garden gnomes and hanging laundry outside. Nadine confirmed that Karen had rewritten several internal policies without board votes, and worse, had diverted HOA funds to hire a private compliance assistant. That assistant? Her nephew. No job posting. No qualifications. Just a monthly check for $500 for quote monitoring violations. Rachel thanked her and added the information to the growing file. The case wasn't just personal anymore. It was procedural, financial, and potentially criminal. Karen had tried to arrest the sheriff in her own driveway, and now the sheriff was coming for her. Not out of spite, but in defense of every neighbor who had ever been bullied, threatened, or fined for nonsense. It was no longer about a parking dispute. It was about power, abuse, and consequences. And it was far from over. 2 days after Karen was served the cease and desist, I walked out to grab the mail and found another surprise waiting for us. This time, it wasn't a handwritten threat or a neon-colored violation note. No, Karen had escalated things to full-blown legal absurdity. Sitting in our mailbox, stamped and everything, was a formal complaint from the HOA citing my wife for the unauthorized use of an official vehicle on private neighborhood grounds, alleging intimidation through attire, and demanding a formal HOA arbitration hearing. The letter was attached to a photo of Rachel's patrol SUV in our driveway, taken at a crooked angle, probably from behind a bush. It looked like evidence from a backyard spy ring. I stood in the driveway reading it out loud, and Rachel, who was inside cleaning her service weapon after a training session, just rolled her eyes and muttered she's doubling down with both feet. We didn't respond right away. Rachel had already filed official complaints through the sheriff's office, and the legal team was now taking over the deeper investigation. But Karen's latest move was more than just irritating, it was theatrical. She wasn't content with embarrassing herself in front of deputies and neighbors. Now she wanted a courtroom stage. The next morning, we got a call from the sheriff's department's legal counsel, letting us know that Karen had indeed filed a civil suit, alleging misuse of police authority, emotional distress, and character defamation. The target? Rachel. Not the HOA. Not the county. Just Rachel, personally. The sheriff. For parking. In her own driveway. I laughed, then stopped laughing when I realized we'd have to show up in court for this nonsense. Rachel, unfazed, pulled out a folder titled Karen Case and began organizing evidence. She already had photos, video, property documents, a log of every false HOA claim, the body cam footage, and a fresh stack of emails leaked from former board members. Karen, it seemed, was trying to put out a fire by throwing gasoline at a gas station. One of those former board members, a quiet accountant named Leah, reached out privately and asked to meet. We met at the local coffee shop, where Leah showed up with a nervous smile and a laptop bag. She'd only served under Karen for 6 months but had quietly archived everything she'd been sent. Inside her files were receipts, HOA newsletters with false citations, and most damning of all, a ledger showing HOA payments labeled miscellaneous consulting fees that had been signed off by Karen alone. Leah pointed to one entry marked July 17th. Community Defense Operations Retainer, $900. Under that was another. HOA Strategic Enforcement Training Seminar, $450. Leah said that seminar was her nephew running a YouTube video and handing out fake badges. Rachel took the files and added them to her growing mountain of documentation. It was one thing to harass neighbors, but now it was looking like misappropriation of funds and fraud. Rachel immediately forwarded the documents to the county auditor's office. The sheriff's legal team had also begun poking around, asking how HOA dues were spent and whether Karen had legal authority to enact half the rules she was pushing. The timing couldn't have been better, because the court date for Karen's absurd lawsuit was scheduled for that Friday. Friday morning came fast. The courtroom was packed, not just with legal reps but with curious neighbors. Word had spread, and people brought their coffee and popcorn like it was neighborhood theater. Karen entered like royalty, wearing a tailored beige suit with HOA Forever embroidered on the lapel and a massive binder under one arm. She waved to someone in the gallery and gave Rachel a smirk like she'd already won. Her lawyer, a guy I recognized from a billboard ad about car accidents and dog bites, stood up and began with the most dramatic opening statement I'd ever heard in a civil hearing. He claimed Karen had suffered emotional trauma, intimidation, and was now unable to enjoy her leadership role due to Rachel's intense militarized presence. Rachel said nothing. Her legal rep, an unassuming woman named Carla with the quiet voice of someone who'd won bigger fights with smaller words, calmly stood up and handed the judge our response packet. Then she played the bodycam footage. The room went completely silent as the screen showed Karen slapping a citation on a patrol SUV, yelling about arrests, and refusing to acknowledge the sheriff's identity even after being told plainly. There were audible gasps when Karen claimed authority over the sheriff's own driveway. But the moment that really broke the silence was when Karen's voice echoed through the speakers. "You're not the law here, I am." The judge raised his eyebrows and turned to Karen. "Is that you making the citizen's arrest?" Karen hesitated. She said yes, but added that she believed she had authority under HOA Statute 11. The judge asked her to produce that statute. Karen fumbled in her binder, flipping past dozens of pages of what appeared to be printouts from internet forums. When asked directly if she had the power to issue legal citations or restrain vehicles on non-HOA property, Karen replied the community needs to feel safe. Rachel's side didn't even need to rebut it. The judge asked for the property exemption form, and Rachel produced the deed and county map proving her home was outside the HOA boundary. It had been grandfathered in before the HOA even existed. That's when things took a dramatic turn. The judge, now visibly annoyed, asked Karen whether she had confirmed jurisdiction before issuing citations or attempting a citizen's arrest. She tried to pivot again, claiming that the sheriff's presence had caused a panic. But the gallery's quiet laughter betrayed the truth. The judge turned to her lawyer and asked whether his client understood the legal implications of impersonating an officer and submitting fraudulent citations. The lawyer tried to backtrack, asking for leniency, calling it a misunderstanding. The judge was not having it. He dismissed the case entirely, citing it as frivolous and potentially retaliatory. Then, he issued a formal warning to Karen, stating that any further actions resembling harassment or impersonation would be grounds for criminal charges. Karen's face turned red, then purple, then something between the two. She grabbed her binder and stormed out of the courtroom, brushing past neighbors who couldn't hide their smirks. Some applauded quietly. One man muttered, "Should have parked better in your own ego." The courtroom buzzed with energy as Rachel shook hands with the legal team and calmly walked out, smiling but composed. I followed her to the car and said, "Well, that was a decent episode too." She grinned. "We're just getting to the season finale." That night we got another anonymous message. A link to a shared folder filled with HOA internal documents, board meeting recordings, and even audio files of Karen berating board members who disagreed with her. One voice in the recording trembled as Karen threatened to remove them from the committee if they didn't vote to fine a family for placing a little free library box on their lawn. That was the last piece of the puzzle. Rachel compiled everything and submitted it to the county DA. It wasn't just a driveway feud anymore. It was now a full investigation into HOA corruption, misappropriation of funds, and abuse of position. Karen had gone after the sheriff with citations and paranoia. Now the sheriff was going after her with the law. And for the first time, Karen was about to find out what real consequences felt like. The courtroom may have closed its doors on Karen's ridiculous lawsuit, but the real storm was only beginning. What had started as a petty attempt to control where Rachel parked had spiraled into something far larger than our neighborhood drama. With the case dismissed and the evidence we'd gathered now in the hands of county investigators, the focus shifted away from Rachel and squarely onto Karen. By the following week, we noticed fewer HOA patrols and none of the usual threats in our mailbox. But the quiet wasn't peace. It was the eerie calm of someone retreating just long enough to reload. And sure enough, Karen wasn't done. 2 days after the hearing, a folded flyer was taped to every front door in the neighborhood. Karen had titled it Community Emergency Memo and filled it with unhinged rants about unauthorized law enforcement presence, the need to restore HOA independence, and how one individual with a badge is endangering our community's moral compass. She even referred to Rachel as an external agent of governmental interference. The flyer was so bizarre and convoluted that one neighbor sent it to a satire website, thinking it was a joke. But to Karen, it was war. She had lost in court, been publicly humiliated, and now she was trying to rally what little power she had left. What she didn't know was that her own board was turning on her. Quietly, several members began contacting the sheriff's office and Rachel directly, sharing additional evidence. One even walked into the precinct with a USB drive full of internal emails. Those emails confirmed what we'd suspected for weeks. Karen had been manipulating board votes, overriding procedures, and even inventing policies that had never been ratified. She had created phantom fines, applied penalties without hearings, and funneled HOA money into projects no one approved. The files included receipts for unauthorized purchases like a personal laptop, branded HOA jackets, and private security consultations, all billed to the association. Meanwhile, the county auditor's office had completed its preliminary investigation. What they found wasn't just misuse of power. It was financial misconduct. Thousands of dollars in misappropriated funds, duplicate payments to a relative labeled as a consultant, and entire months of undocumented expenses. Karen had created an empire within the HOA, one built on fear, false authority, and silence. But now the silence was broken. With everything we'd collected, the district attorney scheduled a formal administrative hearing to decide whether to pursue criminal charges. Karen, who once strutted through the neighborhood like a monarch, was now facing the full scrutiny of the law. On the day of the hearing, the community center was packed. Chairs had to be added, and people stood along the walls just to listen in. Karen walked in with 2 file boxes and her ever-present smugness, still dressed like she was attending a political convention. She tried to address the room, saying she would clear her name and expose the conspiracy against her. But this wasn't her meeting anymore. The district attorney took the podium, thanked everyone for attending, and then proceeded to lay out the timeline. They went through financial records, playbacks from HOA meetings, and emails where Karen overruled board votes and threatened residents who challenged her. They even played an audio clip of her saying, "If I can't control the sheriff, I'll bury her in paperwork." That one landed like a bomb. The room fell completely silent. Then the DA showed the maps, the property lines, the registry filings that Karen had failed to update for over a decade, and the immunity clause in our deed that clearly excluded our property from HOA enforcement. Rachel didn't say a word the entire time. She didn't have to. Her silence carried more authority than Karen's loudest outburst. Karen kept trying to interject, flipping through her notes and shouting about insubordination and community chaos. At one point she tried to argue that her authority stemmed from a moral obligation, which the DA countered by pointing out that moral obligations didn't excuse embezzlement. By the time it was over, the HOA board had heard enough. They voted, right there, on the spot, to place Karen on indefinite suspension pending criminal charges. A motion passed 9-0, with even her closest ally abstaining. Karen stood there frozen, jaw locked, eyes wide, then threw up her hands and called it a witch hunt. She stormed out, knocking over a stack of chairs as she went. People didn't cheer, but the air in the room felt different, like a collective exhale after years of tension. Later that evening, as Rachel and I sat on the porch enjoying a rare moment of calm, we saw a familiar car creep slowly down our street. Karen. She drove past once, then again, this time stopping near the edge of our lawn. She sat in the driver's seat, glaring at our home, probably imagining how things might have been different if Rachel hadn't moved in. Then, as if trying to reclaim even a sliver of control, she pulled out a megaphone from her passenger seat and began yelling about unlawful justice, corrupt systems, and how the community had betrayed her. She had completely snapped. I picked up my phone and called it in. Rachel just shook her head and said she's breaking her restraining order. Again. Within minutes, a deputy arrived. When Karen saw the patrol car pull up, she dropped the megaphone and tried to act casual, like she was simply parked and reflecting on her day. But it was too late. The deputy approached, asked for her license, and reminded her that per the restraining order, she couldn't be within 200 feet of our property. Karen argued, saying she was on a public road. The deputy asked her to step out of the vehicle. She refused. 2 more units arrived. She was eventually escorted out in handcuffs, not for parking, but for violating the order and disturbing the peace. The neighbors came out to watch. No one said anything. No one helped her. Everyone just stood there, silent witnesses to the final collapse of the HOA tyrant. Karen shouted about lawsuits, investigations, how she would get revenge, but it all sounded hollow. She had burned every bridge, alienated every ally, and now even the system she tried to weaponize was working against her. The very next week, the newly restructured HOA sent out a notice about emergency reforms. They were implementing oversight protocols, transparency measures, and a rotating review committee so no single person could ever wield unchecked power again. Rachel was offered a seat on that committee, but she politely declined. She said she already had enough power to protect the public and didn't need to sit in another meeting to prove it. Instead, she recommended a community liaison officer, someone residents could talk to when they felt unheard. The board accepted her proposal. Meanwhile, the local paper picked up the story. Their headline was equal parts satisfying and surreal. HOA president faces charges after trying to arrest county sheriff. Underneath was a photo of Rachel, in uniform, standing beside a neighbor's lemonade stand. The caption read, "The law lives here." That weekend, the community threw an unofficial block party. Someone printed T-shirts that said "My driveway's under protection." Someone else brought a karaoke machine and played "I Fought the Law" on loop. Rachel even parked her squad car sideways across our driveway for a laugh. She leaned against it with sunglasses on while kids drew chalk outlines around it like a crime scene. It was the first time in months that people laughed without tension. No fines. No threats. Just neighbors being neighbors. The nightmare was over, or at least contained. Karen's empire was in ruins, her reputation unrecoverable. And the sheriff? She had parked her cruiser, sipped her coffee, and reminded everyone what real power looks like when it's used with restraint, patience, and just the right amount of timing. It had been 3 peaceful weeks since Karen's breakdown, and the neighborhood had begun to breathe again. For the first time in what felt like forever, people waved without worry, kids rode bikes without being cited for reckless sidewalk movement, and front yards started to bloom with creativity once suppressed under Karen's iron rule. Lawns that were once forced into dull uniformity suddenly had personality again. Painted rocks, bird feeders, solar lights, even a pink plastic flamingo or two. The HOA, now operating under interim leadership, had begun issuing newsletters with actual community updates instead of weekly threats. It was a slow return to normalcy, the kind you only recognize after chaos has left. Rachel kept her role low-key during all of it. She declined interviews, turned down offers to speak at town halls, and avoided neighborhood politics altogether. She wasn't doing any of this for applause or popularity. She just wanted to protect our peace and make sure no one else had to go through what we did. But as much as she tried to step out of the spotlight, her presence still echoed. People waved at her with extra enthusiasm, some gave her small thank you notes tucked into grocery bags, and one kid even gave her a badge he made out of aluminum foil that said Sheriff Rachel of Earth. But even as the community began to move on, Karen didn't. She may have been silenced publicly, but her obsession hadn't faded. It simmered in the background like a forgotten pot boiling over. Rumors swirled that she was preparing a counter-lawsuit or trying to start her own neighborhood justice group outside the HOA's jurisdiction. No one saw her in person anymore, but a few caught glimpses of her car at odd hours, rolling slowly past certain houses. One neighbor swore she saw Karen in the bushes near the community park, taking notes in a notepad. We all brushed it off as exaggeration. Until one night when Karen struck again, this time with a last, desperate, wildly miscalculated stunt. It happened during a quiet Thursday evening. Rachel was on the back patio trimming one of her bonsai trees when the doorbell rang. I opened it to find two men in cheap security uniforms standing awkwardly on our porch. They introduced themselves as part of the newly formed Neighborhood Compliance Task Force. I stared at them for a moment before asking who exactly formed this task force. They handed me a homemade flyer, complete with grammatical errors and an old clip art sheriff's badge. At the bottom, in all caps, was the line, "Founded by concerned citizen Kr." I called Rahel, who stepped inside with pruning shears still in hand. She glanced at the flyer and then looked at the two men like she was deciding whether to be amused or annoyed. She asked who authorized them to patrol this neighborhood, and they claimed they were acting under residential emergency codes. Rachel asked them to cite the code. One fumbled through a binder filled with printed Wikipedia pages. The other just shrugged and said they were told to check properties for potential infiltration. That's when Rachel calmly identified herself and asked if they were aware they were currently standing on a sheriff's property while impersonating public authority. The men froze. One dropped his folder. Rachel stepped forward, pointed at the patrol car at the curb, and gave them a choice: leave quietly or get booked. They left. Fast. I couldn't help but laugh as they tripped over our welcome mat on the way out. But Rachel wasn't laughing. She pulled out her phone and called the sheriff's department. Within the hour, they had traced the two men back to Karen, who had hired them through a neighborhood protection initiative registered under a fake LLC she created online. This time, Karen didn't just violate her restraining order. She had stepped into active criminal territory again: attempted impersonation of security personnel, unauthorized surveillance, and incitement. A formal warrant was issued. The next morning, sheriff's deputies served it at her home. Karen refused to answer the door. She tried to delay by shouting from a second-story window that she was being targeted by rogue agents, but it didn't matter. The warrant was valid. Deputies entered with a court order, and what they found inside her house was jaw-dropping. Karen had turned her living room into a full-blown command center. Whiteboards lined the walls with timelines, property maps, and names of every household in the neighborhood. There were photos of Rachel, some taken from a disturbing distance, and bizarre journal entries detailing imagined conspiracies. She had printed out HOA rules, rewritten them by hand, and taped them across windows like she was preparing for battle. And in the center of it all was a large cardboard sign that read, "Justice will be mine." The sheriff's office removed Karen from the home for psychiatric evaluation, and a mental health intervention team was brought in. The story went public again, this time hitting local news stations with the headline "Former HOA President Arrested After Creating Vigilante Task Force." Rachel's phone blew up, but again, she chose to stay quiet. She told the reporters, "I'm here to serve the people, not to chase cameras. I just hope she gets the help she needs, and that no one else ever uses a fake badge to terrorize their neighbors." Following the arrest, the HOA officially removed Karen's name from all documents and stripped her of every title and privilege. Her email access was shut down, her golf cart was impounded for registration violations, and all policies enacted under her rule were suspended pending review. One by one, the neighborhood peeled back the layers of control she had wrapped around them. Fines were reversed. Meetings became civil again. And the most poetic change? Rachel's squad car now had a permanent designated spot in our driveway, protected under a new HOA bylaw titled Rachel's Law, an official clause exempting emergency and law enforcement vehicles from any form of residential restriction. To celebrate, the neighborhood organized something they called the Freedom Driveway Festival. It was equal parts block party and inside joke. Neighbors lined the street with mock crime scene tape around their driveways, created fake HOA violation trophies, and even set up a dunk tank with a cardboard Karen cutout that could be triggered with a direct hit. Rachel stood by with a quiet smile as people toasted to no more paranoia and no more pop-up bylaws. Kids ran around wearing plastic badges that said "Not You," Karen, and adults laughed freely, a sound that had been rare for too long. Later that evening, as the party died down and the sky turned a soft orange, I found Rachel sitting on the porch, boots off, eyes half closed. She looked peaceful. I asked her what she was thinking. She said, "I joined law enforcement to protect people. I never thought the biggest fight I'd face would come from someone policing mailboxes and trash cans." She paused, then added, "But maybe it's those fights that matter most, because they happen where we live, where people expect to feel safe. If you can't feel safe on your own driveway, what's the badge even for?" I didn't say anything. I just sat beside her, sipping what was left of my lemonade, as laughter drifted from down the street and tiki lights flickered like stars on fence posts. Karen was gone. The tyranny was over. And somehow, without intending to, Rachel had done more than just protect our rights. She'd restored a community. Not through force. Not through power. But by showing calm in chaos, law in madness, and what happens when someone finally stands up and says enough. And though she'd never admit it, every single person on that block slept easier that night because of her. Because sometimes the scariest sheriff isn't the one with the biggest gun, but the one with the biggest patience. And in this neighborhood, that made all the difference.